Hey there, flat picker. Have you ever had a mini panic attack at a jam session because you had no idea what scales to use over the tune? Maybe you stumbled into playing some of the right notes, but had no idea what they were and why they were the right notes. Well, if so, this lesson is for you, my friend, because today we are going to be covering the most essential scales for bluegrass guitar and why they don't matter. I'm sort of joking about that last part, but in my opinion, there are some better ways to think about note choices over chords in bluegrass tune than just scales. But that being said, scales can be a great way for us to latch on to some good sounding notes and immediately dive into that jam session. The first scale that I want to talk about is the major pentatonic scale. You might be wondering why the major scale is not my first choice here. Well, the major scale gives us two problematic notes if you play them over the one chord. Check this out. You probably saw me make some funny looks as I was playing through all of the notes of the G major scale there. And there were two in particular that to my ear don't exactly sound like a great choice over a G chord. The 4, the C note, and the 7, the F sharp note. Together, those make what's called a tritone, or the devil's interval, and you might be able to tell why it's called that from listening to that right there. So check this out. If I play both at the same time over a G chord, it becomes really apparent why we don't want those notes. So what happens if we take the 4 and the 7 out of the major scale? Well, we are left with, my friend, the major pentatonic scale. The root, 2nd, 3rd, 5th, and 6th of that major scale. Why do we choose those notes? Well, pretty much all of them can be seen as a consonant note over the scale. And there's also another reason. When we're playing in the key of G, this scale works really nicely over almost all of the chord changes, because over the one chord, we have a G, B, and a D, all of our triad notes in there. Over the 4 chord, we have the E and the G, the 3rd and the 5th. And then over our 5 chord, we have the root and the 5th of the 5 chord, the D and an A note. So pretty much no matter what chord you are playing in this key, you're going to stumble into some of the chord tones, which are going to sound really good over top of that chord. Also, all of the other notes that we have in that scale generally don't sound too bad over the chord changes either, but your ear will probably want you to move off of those notes as you play through them. Say you're just getting started with the major pentatonic scale and bluegrass improvisation. How might we use this major pentatonic scale to our advantage? I like to break it into 3 and 4 note groupings and play that over any common set of bluegrass chord changes just to get used to the angular feel of this scale. Let's start with some 3 note groupings. To my ear, that already sounds like some good fodder for bluegrass improvisation. But let's go ahead and take a look at those 4 note groupings that I was talking about. Once again, to my ear, already sounds like some good fodder for bluegrass improvisation. Now, just like with any pattern, you don't want to stick to one single pattern when you're playing an improv, but it's a good way to get familiar with this scale in a non-linear fashion and start to replicate what sound like bluegrass lines. Now say you've got a pretty good handle on the G major pentatonic scale and you want to notch it up one level to sound a little more advanced in your improvs. If that's the case, you'll want to switch to the major pentatonic scale for whatever chord you happen to be on at that given point in time. So let's say we're playing a strict 1-4-5 chord progression in G. That's a G chord, a C chord, and a D chord. Over the G, we would want to play the G major pentatonic scale, G, A, B, D, E. Over the C chord, our 4 chord, we would want to play the C major pentatonic scale, C, D, E, G, A. And then finally over the 5 chord, we would want to play the D major pentatonic scale, D, E, F sharp, A, and B. That may seem like a lot to keep track of, switching in and out of those major pentatonic scales, but one, if you get familiar enough with those scales, it's going to be a lot easier than you think. And two, there's actually kind of a simple hack that you may not have realized. If you look at all of those major pentatonic scales lined up next to one another, the G major pentatonic, C major pentatonic, and D major pentatonic, you might notice something. They all have a lot of notes in common. In fact, the C major pentatonic scale is only one note different than the G major pentatonic. And the same goes for the D major pentatonic scale. So really, we just need to know that G major pentatonic scale, and when we switch to a C chord, change our B's to C notes. Same goes for the 5 chord, G major pentatonic scale, but when that 5 rolls around, change all of your G's to F sharps. Once again, that may seem a little daunting, but I promise you, if you start to practice that with something like Strum Machine, you're gonna get pretty fast. Let's see what that sounds like. I'm gonna play some common bluegrass chord changes, a 1-4-1-5-1 type of progression here. And with each passage, I'm going to play the same octave of my G major pentatonic scale. But when we switch to C, my B note changes to a C. And then when we switch to a D chord, my G changes to an F sharp. Check this out. So it sounds a little lame when I just play the scale up and down like that, but you can already see that the set of pitches that I'm targeting for each chord sounds much more specific to that chord. And when you start to add some of those 3 and 4 note patterns to your major pentatonic scales, it only makes them sound that much better. Lastly, if you're a super fancy advanced picker, there's one more thing that we can do to dress up those pentatonic scales and make them sound a little more like our favorite players. As you've noticed, it sounds a little bland and stale playing just the major pentatonic scale over these chord changes. That's kind of no matter what. I promise you that if you just stick to the major pentatonic scale with no extra notes, it's going to start to sound a little lame after a while. But if we add 2 special notes to this scale, the flat 3 and the flat 7, we expand our options and all of a sudden start to sound more like our favorite players. So for the G major pentatonic scale, our flat 3 is a B flat. Then our flat 7 is an F note, an F natural. So the whole scale with those 2 extra notes would sound like this. Let's check it out and see what they sound like over a G chord, just running the scale up and down. To my ear, already sounds like good fodder for a bluegrass solo, so if you play around with those notes, that's really good. Now, I'll say this, we don't have enough time in today's lesson to discuss how to specifically use those notes, but I have a lesson right here for how to use blue thirds in your playing. There's a specific set of rules and a specific way that you need to treat the blue third whenever you incorporate that into your major pentatonic scale, so go ahead and check that lesson out. All right, so just to recap, we've got 3 different ways that we can play the major pentatonic scale over our bluegrass chord changes. 1, just stick to the major pentatonic scale of the 1 chord, or the root of your key. So in this case, G major pentatonic scale. The second way is to play the appropriate major pentatonic scale for whatever major chord you're on at that point in time. So G major pentatonic for G, C major pentatonic for C, etc. And the third way that we can kind of employ the major pentatonic scale is to use everything that we discussed before, but add blue thirds and flat sevens to all of the scales there to add some more grit and bluesy flavor to the tonality. All right, my friend, you've got one scale that you can use over your bluegrass guitar solos, but I promised you another, didn't I? So next we are going to look at the minor pentatonic scale, the close cousin of our friend the major pentatonic scale. So if you know a little bit of music theory right now, you're probably saying to yourself, well, Hayes, isn't the major pentatonic scale and the minor pentatonic scale the same thing? Well, yes and no. The G major pentatonic scale, we had the 1, the 2, the 3, the 5, and the 6 in the key of G. That's G, A, B, D, E. Now, let's build a minor pentatonic scale, but starting on the relative minor of G. That would be E minor, the 6th degree of the G scale. The E minor pentatonic scale has a bit of a different formula than the major pentatonic scale. We've got a 1, a flat 3, a 4, a 5, and a flat 7. So in E, that would be E, G, A, B, D, and then back to E. Now if we line up the notes from our major pentatonic scale, G major pentatonic scale, and our E minor pentatonic scale, you might notice a striking similarity between the two of them. They contain the exact same notes. Yes, my friend. So that means if you've learned the G major pentatonic scale and you already know the relative minor of G, you already know the E minor pentatonic scale. And the same goes for any other major pentatonic. So if we're in the key of G again and we're looking at an A minor chord, that means you could play the C major pentatonic scale, the one that we just worked on in the last example. And for B minor, you can play the D major pentatonic scale, the other scale that we looked at in our last example. So that's a great way to employ your minor pentatonic scales. Just play the relative major scale, but maybe start on the root note of whatever chord you're on. So for E minor pentatonic, start on that E note. This scale is pretty special because not only can that minor pentatonic scale be played over minor chords like E minor, it can be played over its parallel major chord as well, meaning that E minor pentatonic works well over an E major chord. Just sounds bluesy, right? Now that usage right there is typically how bluegrass players like to incorporate it into their own solos. We're looking at you, Tony Rice. So let's check out the G minor pentatonic scale. This example right here is the most common shape that people typically learn first and is the one that you'll get the most mileage out of. So we've got 3rd fret on our low E string, and then 3, 6, 3, 5, 3, 5, 3, 5, 3, 6, 3, 6. That's G, B flat, C, D, F, G. And then repeats. B flat, C, D, F, G. And you can put that B flat on top too. So let's see how that sounds over a G major chord, and we'll use the same patterns that we used from the major pentatonic scale. 3-note patterns and 4-note patterns. To my ear, that sounds nice and gritty and bluesy. So if you've got a tune like Wild Bill Jones or something with a flat 7 chord in it, that scale is going to sound really awesome over your solos. Let's see what this sounds like with 4-note patterns. already tell, especially when we start on that descending pattern, that we are solidly in the realm of Tony Rice here. Let me show you what this scale looks like in open position 2, because you're definitely going to want to know that one. Just like we did with the next position, you'll want to run that through your 3-note patterns and 4-note patterns. Say you're an intermediate player and you've already got a pretty good handle on this minor pentatonic over the 1 framework. Well, I've got a special tool for you, my friend. This approach is what I hear most often in bluegrass music. So if you're a level 2 player, like intermediate player, what I would do is play major pentatonic over most of the chord changes, but then on the 5-1 resolution at the end of the form, employ that minor pentatonic scale. It creates kind of an interesting juxtaposition between the major pentatonic tonality and the minor pentatonic tonality, and to me, adds some weight to the resolution of your solo. Check this out. Once again, I'm just playing these scales up and down. It's not anything terribly revolutionary, but you can already see that adding that minor pentatonic to the end of the phrase adds a different character and color to it, and to my ear, closes the solo really well. Okay, now say that you're an advanced player and you've already got a handle on all of this stuff. You've even got some Tony Rice licks to add into your scale runs to make yourself sound like a more authentic bluegrass player. Congratulations. The next thing that I would ask you to do is to start to blend those major and minor pentatonic scales together. So if we lay out all of the notes in the major pentatonic scale and the minor pentatonic scale for G and blend them together, we're left with this: G, A, B flat, B, C, D, E, F. Wait, holy crap. We ended up with more notes than the major scale itself. We've got 8 note choices there, right? Well, don't think about that too much. The reason I like to blend these scales together is because we get a few interesting chromatic passages that we can use to add a little bit more of an advanced flavor to our solos. So for example, if you look at the A to B flat to B, that's a chromatic passage right there. I bet you've heard that a million times, right? So inside of that set of notes, that's the only chromatic passage that we get, but there are 2 other common ones that you'll hear players like Tony Rice and other advanced bluegrass players use. Connecting the 4, the C, to the D note with a C sharp. You've heard a million licks like that. So that's definitely a great one to mess around with. C to D. The last one is to add that F sharp from the G major scale back in, but use it exclusively as a passing tone. Just with a few passing notes in there, you can already see that we've brought both of those pentatonic scales to life after blending them. So if you're an advanced player, that's your mission. Let's see what it sounds like if I blend those 2 scales together and start to add some of those chromatic passages to that same chord progression from earlier. So as you can see, we can get some pretty interesting options that start to sound strikingly more like the bluegrass lines of our favorite players like Tony Rice, Brian Sutton, David Greer, etc. So just to recap, for the minor pentatonic scale, if you're a level 1, a beginner, just take that minor pentatonic scale and play it over the 1 chord. We're talking about a G minor pentatonic scale over the G chord. If you're level 2, play major pentatonic over all of the changes, but at the 5-1 resolution at the end of your solo, play the G minor pentatonic scale. Then, if you're an advanced player, level 3, start to blend those major and minor pentatonic scales together and use those 3 chromatic connecting passages that I talked about. All right, my friend, if you've made it this far, you're probably interested to hear more about what I said at the beginning of this video. We are going to be covering the most essential scales for bluegrass guitar and why they don't matter. What's that guy even talking about anyway? Scales don't matter in bluegrass? Come on, Hayes. Well, in my opinion, there's actually a much better framework to keep track of all of these special notes that we've talked about in our scale practice here today. In my opinion, instead of learning scales, the first thing that we should do as bluegrass improvisers is learn triads. If we were to look at our first scale, the G major pentatonic scale, we've already got a triad in there, like I said earlier, right? G, B, and D. Now, we don't exactly play any of the triads for the rest of those chords using that scale, but the level 2 example was to take all of the relative major pentatonic scales for each of your chords and play them there. So theoretically, over C, we've got C major pentatonic, C, E, G is in there. D major pentatonic, D, F sharp, A is in there. So, in my opinion, that is a much better place for us to start as improvisers when we are first getting started out. The reason I like that is because we are starting from the 3 best sounding notes for each given chord change. G, B, and D are always going to sound good over a G chord. C, E, and G will always sound good over a C chord, etc. If you can learn where all of those triad notes are for each of your 3 chords in first position, then it's just a simple matter of adding some logical passing tones. In my opinion, the major pentatonic scale is just a dressed up triad. It's a triad with 2 logical passing tones in it. The second to get you from root to third, and then the 6th to get you from 5 to 1. So in my opinion, when you're playing a G major pentatonic scale over a G chord, A and E are kind of reserved for just walking between triad tones. So it would make sense to just learn the triad tones first, right? Another implication for learning the triads first is that once you implant those notes, you know that G, B, and D, root 3 and 5 are right there. Well, to add 4 has to be between 3 and 5. So it's much easier to find any of these other notes that I've talked about that add color to our breaks. So if you want to really double down on your scale practice and really make your solos sound good, learn your triads. Now, I've already kept you here for a half hour, so if you want to learn more about triads, go ahead and check out the link below in the description to my Triads mini course inside my guitar club. If you enter the code that's down there, you're going to get a free 30-day trial to try out that Triads course, get them drilled into your brain, and your solos are going to be sounding so good after that month. Okay, before we get out of here, I'm going to take a little break on Sitting on Top of the World, one of my favorite bluegrass tunes, and yes, we are going to add the dreaded 6 minor chord in there for all of you purists, pretty much so I can highlight the E minor pentatonic scale. As I'm playing, take a real close look at this solo and see if you can pick out any of the moves that I described here in the lesson today. I'm not going to put tab on screen, so if you want to work this one out, hit that gear icon, slow her down, and have some fun.